A great civilization vanished into the jungle at the height of its power. This video uncovers the true story of why the Maya abandoned their mega cities. By the end, you will understand the complex web of environmental and human forces that can unravel even the most brilliant society. We will explore why kings lost their divine authority and how decades without rain could shatter an entire world. What does the fate of a lost city tell us about the fragility of our own? From the heart of the city, a great plaza pulses with energy. The air vibrates with the beat of drums and the scent of copal incense rising from temple steps. Below, a sea of people moves through markets overflowing with jade, vibrant feathers, and obsidian blades. Farmers from the countryside, nobles in elaborate headdresses, and priests carrying sacred texts all converge under the gaze of a pyramid that scrapes the sky. This is not a fleeting moment, but the daily reality of the Maya world at its zenith, a period scholars call the Classic Period, spanning roughly 250 to 900 of the Common Era. During these centuries, the Maya lowlands were not a unified empire, but a constellation of brilliant, rival city-states. Places like Calakmul, known as the Kingdom of the Snake, Karakol with its vast agricultural terraces, and Kapon, a center of artistic and intellectual achievement, each commanded networks of influence that stretched for hundreds of miles. Their power was woven from many threads. Master astronomers tracked the cycles of Venus with breathtaking precision, their calculations etched into stone. Scribes developed the most sophisticated writing system in the ancient Americas, recording history, rituals, and royal lineages on towering monuments. This intellectual might was matched by economic muscle, as trade routes moved salt, cotton, cacao, and ideas between these competing capitals. The landscape itself was transformed, supporting populations denser than many places in Europe at the time. This was a world of profound confidence where kings, believed to be divine intermediaries, commissioned temples that were both statements of power and portals to the gods. To stand in one of these plazas was to witness a civilization at the peak of its creative and organizational power, which makes the silence that followed so utterly bewildering. How does a network of such vibrant, interconnected cities, each a testament to human ingenuity, simply walk away from everything they built? The answer begins not with a single catastrophe, but with a slow, creeping strain on the very foundations of their world. The story of their departure is written in stone, but the final pages are missing. For centuries, the Maya meticulously documented their world on towering stone slabs called stelae. These were not mere decorations, they were history books carved in limestone, recording the ascensions of kings, great military victories, and sacred calendar events that connected rulers to the gods. Scholars called epigraphers have painstakingly learned to read this intricate script, allowing us to follow the dynastic lines of cities like Tikal and Palenque as if reading a royal chronicle. Then the chronicle simply stops, one by one, across the southern lowlands. The tradition of erecting these dated monuments grinds to a halt. The last dated monument at the mighty city of Tikal, for instance, is Stela 11, carved in the year 869 of the Common Era. After that, silence. This is not a gradual decline in record-keeping, it is an abrupt and systemic failure. The silence of the stelae tells us that the very institution of kingship, the political engine that commissioned these monuments and organized society, had broken down. The scribes who held this sacred knowledge laid down their tools. It is as if the state itself had forgotten how to tell its own story, leaving us with a chilling question. What could have shattered the authority of the divine king, the central figure around which all of Maya power and identity revolved? The silence of the stelae is echoed by the empty rooms of the palaces. To walk through the residential compounds of a Maya elite, centuries after the last footstep faded, is to encounter a scene suspended in time. An archaeologist might find a finely carved jade bead resting on a floor, or a set of elegant serving bowls left on a low bench, as if the owner had just stepped out for a moment and fully intended to come back. This is one of the most telling clues, the physical archaeology of abandonment. At many of the great centers, there is a striking absence of the signs we typically associate with societal collapse. Researchers find no layers of ash from widespread fires, no heaps of shattered weapons in the streets, no mass resting places that would indicate a sudden, violent end. Instead, the story told by the dirt is one of a gradual, deliberate departure. Valuable items, the kind any fleeing population would take, were simply left behind. This pattern has led scholars like Dr. Lisa Lucero to emphasize the largely non-violent nature of the abandonment in the core cities. It suggests people were not running from an invading army, but from something else entirely. To understand this, we need to distinguish between two kinds of endings. There is catastrophic abandonment, where a disaster like a volcanic eruption or an attack forces an immediate, panicked flight. Then there is the slower, more insidious process of depopulation, where a place bleeds out its people over years or decades as the reasons to stay slowly erode. The Maya collapse was overwhelmingly the latter. Look at Capon in modern-day Honduras. Excavations there reveal a telling sequence. The elaborate stone palaces of the ruling elite, nestled in the city's heart, were the first to be left empty. The outlying farmsteads, the homes of the commoners who supported the whole system, persisted for a bit longer. This is a clear signal of a society crumbling from the top down. The central authority, the king and his court, lost their power to command labor, their divine legitimacy, or their ability to provide security. When the palace could no longer fulfill its fundamental promises, the social contract dissolved. People did not revolt in a single uprising, they simply stopped believing, and eventually they stopped coming. The grand courtyards and audience halls, once the nerve centers of power, became mere stone shells, monuments to a vanished social order that could not sustain its own weight. If it wasn't an enemy's sword that emptied these cities, then what force was potent enough to make a people willingly walk away from their homes, their history, and their gods? The Maya world was a masterpiece of balance, but that balance was terrifyingly fragile. For all their intellectual and architectural triumphs, these cities existed on an ecological tightrope, one that began to sway under a force no king could command, the sky itself. The most compelling modern theory points not to invasion, but to evaporation, to a climate that slowly turned against them. At the heart of this theory is a simple, inescapable fact. The entire Maya lowland civilization was utterly dependent on seasonal rainfall. There were no great rivers like the Nile to irrigate their fields, only a relentless cycle of wet and dry seasons. Their brilliant adaptations, the intricate reservoir systems and soil conservation techniques, were designed to capture and store water from the rains. Their survival was a precise calculation against the calendar. But what happens when the rains simply stop coming? For decades, this was a compelling hypothesis. Then science provided the proof, written not in stone but in mud and mineral. Researchers began extracting long cores of sediment from the bottoms of ancient Maya lakes. Like reading the rings of a tree, they could analyze layers of pollen, soil, and chemical isotopes year by year, century by century. Even more precise data came from deep within caves. In places like Yok Balam Cave in Belize, scientists studied stalagmites, those stone pillars that grow up from cave floors. As water drips from the ceiling, it deposits tiny layers of calcite, capturing a chemical snapshot of the climate above. By measuring the ratio of oxygen isotopes in each layer, paleoclimatologists like Dr. Douglas Kennett could reconstruct a stunningly accurate rainfall record stretching back over 2,000 years. The story these natural archives tell is stark. they reveal a pattern of severe multi-decadal droughts or megadroughts that struck right at the heart of the classic Maya collapse period, particularly between the years 800 and 900 of the Common Era. These were not brief dry spells, they were climatic shifts that could last a generation or more, a relentless parching of the land. Imagine the strain. A city's elaborate reservoir network, a marvel of engineering designed to last through the annual dry season, begins to empty and does not refill. The following year, it refills only halfway. After a decade, the great ceremonial tanks are nothing but cracked mud, and the water table has sunk beyond the reach of even the deepest wells. Crops fail not just once but repeatedly. The staple maize withers in the field. The forest game that supplemented diets retreats to ever-shrinking pockets of moisture. For a society where the king's primary divine duty was to ensure agricultural abundance and summon the rains through ritual, this was more than an ecological crisis. It was a spiritual and political catastrophe. The environment, once a partner they had learned to manage with incredible skill, had become an insurmountable foe. A prolonged drought did not just cause hunger, it systematically unraveled every thread holding the Maya world together. But if drought was the spark, what was the kindling? What vulnerabilities within Maya society itself turned a climate crisis into a civilizational collapse? A prolonged drought did more than dry up reservoirs, it lit a fuse that ran straight to the heart of Maya society. Think of their civilization not as a single pillar, but as an intricate web where food, faith, politics, and trade were all tightly connected. When one strand snapped under the strain of a changing climate, the tension began to pull on all the others, starting a cascade of failures that no one could stop. The first and most direct impact was on the land itself. The Maya were masterful farmers, but their primary crop, maize, is notoriously thirsty. One failed rainy season could be survived with stored grain. 2 or 3 consecutive seasons of poor harvests, however, would empty the granaries. This was not just scarcity, it was famine. A population weakened by hunger becomes vulnerable in other ways. Malnutrition opens the door to illness, and in the crowded conditions of a city, even common ailments can spread with devastating speed. Skeletal remains from the terminal classic period show clear signs of this hardship, with evidence of stunted growth and poor health becoming more common. This created a public health crisis that further sapped the strength and resilience of communities, making the challenge of survival even more daunting. But the true unraveling happened in the minds and hearts of the people. For the Maya, the king was not just a political ruler, he was the Kuhul Ajor, the Holy Lord, a divine intermediary whose most sacred duty was to communicate with the gods of rain and fertility. The entire social order was built on this sacred contract. The people provided labor and loyalty, and in return, the king performed the rituals to ensure the rains came, the crops grew, and the world remained in balance. So when the drought stretched on for years, and the king's most elaborate ceremonies at the temple summit failed to bring a single cloud, what then? The failure was not just agricultural, it was theological. The king's divine mandate evaporated under the same sun that baked the fields. If the Holy Lord could not speak to Chak, the rain god, then he was not holy at all. The very foundation of political authority crumbled into dust. Faith in the system dissolved, and with it, the willingness to obey, to build another monument, or to fight another war for a discredited ruler. This crisis of legitimacy then ignited conflicts closer to home. As resources dwindled, cooperation turned to competition. Within a city-state, elite factions likely turned on each other, vying for control over the last reliable water sources or food stores. The intricate trade networks that connected city-states, the lifeblood of the Maya economy, would have fractured. Why send your precious remaining salt or obsidian to an ally who can offer nothing in return? Alliances forged over generations broke down, replaced by a desperate, every city for itself mentality. There is archaeological evidence from this period of increased fortifications around some centers and a rise in violent conflict, not from a mysterious foreign invader, but from former neighbors. The environmental shock did not create new flaws in Maya society. Instead, it acted like a high-powered spotlight, exposing every point of stress. It revealed a political system too centralized, too dependent on the flawless performance of a single individual. It revealed an economic system that relied on stability and cooperation, and it revealed a religious worldview that could not withstand the silence of the gods. The drought was the spark, but the kindling was the complex, interconnected, and ultimately fragile nature of their own brilliant creation. This systemic collapse raises a haunting final question. If the center could not hold, where did everyone go? The story does not end with empty cities, but with a profound and deliberate migration, a search for a new beginning in a landscape they knew intimately. Even the most fertile land has its limits. For all their ingenuity, the Maya were engaged in a constant, high-stakes negotiation with the soil beneath their feet. To feed the dense populations of their flourishing cities, they pushed their agricultural systems to an extraordinary degree, and some researchers believe this very success created a hidden vulnerability, a slow-burning crisis that left them dangerously exposed when the rains finally failed. Think of it like a farmer who, year after year, coaxes ever greater harvests from the same plot. For a time, the land provides, but slowly, invisibly, its strength is being drained away. The Maya employed a sophisticated mix of farming techniques. The most well-known is the milpa system, a form of slash-and-burn agriculture where a patch of forest is cleared, cultivated for a few years, and then left to lie fallow and regenerate for a much longer period. This cycle worked beautifully when populations were lower and land was plentiful. But as cities swelled, the pressure to produce more food faster likely shortened those crucial fallow periods. The forest never got a full chance to recover, leading to widespread deforestation. Without the deep roots of trees to hold it in place, the thin tropical soil was left bare to the torrential rains, washing away the precious, nutrient-rich topsoil in a process called erosion. This wasn't their only method, however. In hilly areas like Capon, they built intricate stone terraces to create flat planting surfaces and prevent runoff. In swampy lowlands like those around the great city of Tikal, they constructed raised fields, essentially artificial islands of fertile soil built up from dredged muck and vegetation. These were brilliant adaptations, allowing them to farm in difficult terrain and even produce multiple crops a year. But here, too, lay a potential risk. Intensive, continuous cultivation on these managed plots, without the natural replenishment of a forest cycle, could gradually deplete the soil of essential nutrients. Over centuries, the very breadbaskets that sustained urban life may have been slowly losing their vitality. Soil scientists studying lake cores have found intriguing evidence to support this. Layers of sediment from the late Classic period show increased amounts of mineral particles, a strong indicator that soil erosion from deforested hillsides was accelerating. At the same time, pollen analysis suggests a decline in the diversity of plants, pointing towards stressed ecosystems and simplified agricultural landscapes. The expert view emerging is that agricultural yields may have already been trending downward, even before the megadroughts began. The Maya civilization, in its magnificent expansion, might have been quietly approaching the carrying capacity of its environment, that ecological tipping point where a land can no longer support the demands placed upon it. They were living with less and less margin for error, so when the climate shock arrived in the form of prolonged drought, it didn't just hit a robust system, it struck one that was already fatigued, where the soils were thinner, the reserves lower, and the resilience of the farmland already compromised. Their greatest achievement, building those teeming mega-cities, may have required a level of extraction from the land that simply could not be maintained forever. In trying to master their world, they may have inadvertently weakened the very foundation that supported it, a poignant lesson in how the pursuit of growth can sometimes undermine long-term survival. This paints a picture of a civilization caught in a perfect storm, but if the heartland was emptying, where did the people actually go? The final chapter of the Maya story is not one of disappearance, but of deliberate and difficult transformation. The stone monuments tell a second, darker story alongside the silence. While many cities were simply left behind, others bear the scars of a far more violent ending. In the final centuries of the Classic period, a profound shift rippled through Maya society, one recorded in stark relief on the very stelae that had once proclaimed divine harmony. The imagery changes. Earlier carvings show kings in moments of serene ritual, receiving the symbols of power from ancestors or gods. But by the 8th and 9th centuries, the narrative turns grim. We see bound captives, rulers from rival cities, humiliated at the feet of a triumphant king. The text shifts from celebrating births and accessions to glorifying conquest, using terms that speak of Star War campaigns intended to utterly subjugate an enemy. This was no longer ritualized conflict for taking sacrificial captives. It was total war aimed at political annihilation. Archaeology on the ground confirms this brutal turn. At cities like Dos Pilas and Aguatka, researchers have found hastily built defensive walls, crude fortifications thrown up around ceremonial centers that were never meant to be fortresses. More telling are the discoveries within. In some locations, what appear to be final resting places from the city's last days contain not careful burials, but jumbled remains of individuals, sometimes with injuries consistent with conflict, placed without ceremony. These sites speak of a society under siege where the sacred precinct became a last redoubt. To understand how warfare became this destructive engine, look to the great rivalry of the age, the centuries-long struggle between the two Maya superpowers, Tikal and Calakmul. Think of them as ancient analogues to competing empires, each leading vast networks of allied cities in a complex, shifting web of diplomacy and betrayal. Their conflict was not a single battle but a perpetual Cold War that occasionally flared into open violence, draining the resources of an entire region. Allies were forced to choose sides, trade routes were weaponized or severed, and generations of young men were mobilized not to farm but to fight. This endemic warfare created a feedback loop of collapse. As drought stressed agricultural systems, competition for the most fertile, well-watered land intensified, sparking more conflict. That very warfare then made the food crisis worse, as armies marched through and burned enemy fields, destroying the livelihood of entire communities. Trade, the system that distributed essential goods like salt, obsidian for tools, and prestige items for elites, fractured completely. Why would a merchant risk the journey between cities now at war? The result was economic isolation and scarcity on a local level. For the common people, this political fragmentation meant an impossible choice. They could remain in vulnerable, open farmland and risk being caught in the crossfire, or they could flee to increasingly crowded and fortified urban centers. Many chose to abandon their homes entirely, not just because of drought, but because their world had become too dangerous. The king, who had failed as a rainmaker, was now also failing as a protector. His last remaining claim to authority, his role as war leader, only accelerated the cycle of violence that was making life untenable. In this light, political collapse was not merely a result of environmental stress. It became a destructive force in its own right, shattering the remaining bonds of Maya society from the inside out. Yet, even as the southern heartland descended into silence and conflict, a profound question lingered. Did an entire civilization truly just vanish, or did its people find a way to carry their world with them? What happens when a population loses faith in its leaders? The final unraveling of Maya society was not just a political or environmental event, it was an ideological one. At its core, the entire social contract was built on a sacred promise. The king, the Kayuhal Ajor, was not merely a ruler, he was the essential bridge between the human world and the divine. His rituals guaranteed the cycle of the seasons, the arrival of the rains, and the fertility of the land. In return, the people offered their labor, their loyalty, and their surplus. This was the deal that built the pyramids and filled the plazas. But when the drought stretched for a generation and the wars brought only more suffering, that divine contract appeared irrevocably broken. The Holy Lord could not command the clouds, the Protector could not ensure safety, so why would anyone keep their end of the bargain? This loss of faith was perhaps the most powerful force in the final act. It transformed hardship into a crisis of legitimacy. Picture a farmer, his family hungry after another failed harvest, looking up at the towering temple where the king performed his ceremonies. The message was clear: the gods were not listening, or the king had lost their favor. In that moment, the entire ideological foundation of the state crumbled. Would you continue to haul stone blocks for a pyramid that celebrated a failed intermediary? Would you surrender your last stores of maize as tribute to a court that could offer no protection? For many, the answer became a quiet but definitive no. We see hints of this profound social shift in the archaeology. At some sites, there is evidence that the grand residences of the elite were not merely abandoned. In a few places, they appear to have been reoccupied by commoners in the final days, their elegant rooms subdivided with crude walls, their fine plaster floors cracked by simpler hearths. This isn't invasion from the outside, it's a reclaiming of space from within, a symbolic dismantling of the old social order. In other instances, researchers have found that royal monuments, those stelae carved with the images of kings, were deliberately toppled or defaced. This was not random vandalism, it was a ritual act of erasure, a community severing its connection to a lineage that had lost its power to intercede with the cosmos. The collapse, then, was not a single revolution with a new leader seizing the palace. It was a wholesale withdrawal of support, a collective decision to stop participating in a system that no longer worked. As the central authority hollowed out, people did not necessarily revolt, they simply reverted. They fell back on the oldest and most resilient unit of society, the family and the local kinship group. The grand vision of the city-state, with its demands for tax and labor, gave way to the immediate needs of the household. The social fabric didn't tear, it unraveled strand by strand as people turned inward, focusing on survival in smaller, more manageable units. This ideological collapse meant that even if the rains had returned 1 year, there was no going back. The faith that had glued millions to a shared project was gone. The people had not vanished, but their belief in the world of the Holy Lords had. And without that belief, the mega-cities were just empty stone waiting for the forest to return. But the Maya themselves did not vanish. While the great inland capitals fell silent, life and power were already flowing toward new horizons. A fourth clue to the collapse is found not in empty plazas, but in bustling ports and rising northern cities. For every fading giant like Tikal, there was a place like Chichen Itza in the northern Yucatan, entering its own golden age. Along the Caribbean coast, centers like Cholum and Santa Rita Corozal continued to thrive for centuries. This reveals a crucial truth: the story is not one of a universal apocalypse, but of a brutal and traumatic reorganization. The heart of Maya civilization didn't stop beating, it simply relocated. This shift was driven by a powerful force, the redirection of economic lifeblood. For centuries, the wealth and prestige of the interior kingdoms were tied to specific trade networks. They controlled the flow of highland obsidian, jade from distant mountains, and the elaborate feathers of the Quetzal bird. Their power was anchored to the land. But as political instability and warfare fractured the interior, and as climate patterns changed, these old routes became hazardous and less profitable. Meanwhile, a different kind of economy was gaining momentum along the coasts. The northern Yucatan and Caribbean shores offered invaluable resources that were suddenly in higher demand. Vast coastal salt flats produced a commodity essential for preserving food and sustaining health. Lush inland areas provided honey, a prized sweetener and base for fermented drinks. Most importantly, the sea itself became a highway. Large, seaworthy canoes could transport goods along the coast with far greater efficiency and safety than overland caravans moving through conflict-ridden territory. This maritime network didn't just connect Maya cities, it opened doors to powerful new trading partners in central Mexico, like the rising influence of the Toltecs. We can think of it as a dramatic economic reorientation. Imagine the flow of wealth as a great river. For centuries, it coursed through the interior, watering the kingdoms of the Patane. But then the river changed its course. It began to bypass the old channels, carving new paths to the coastal plains and the north. The inland mega-cities, once hubs of commerce, found themselves isolated. Their reservoirs might have been dry, but now their markets were too. The goods, the ideas, the innovations, and the political influence followed the money. Ambitious leaders, savvy merchants, and skilled artisans gradually migrated toward these new centers of opportunity. Chichen Itza, with its access to both coastal trade and northern resources, grew into a cosmopolitan powerhouse, blending Maya traditions with new influences from the Gulf Coast. Its art and architecture tell a story of confident, renewed prosperity while the southern forests reclaimed stone palaces. So the abandonment of the classic cities was in part a strategic retreat from economic irrelevance. The people didn't just walk away from drought and war, they were also pulled toward a future that looked brighter elsewhere. The collapse of the interior was a relative decline. It was the painful, visible crumbling of one political and economic model, even as another was being built. This reframes the entire narrative. The Maya did not fail, they adapted in the most profound way possible. They voted with their feet, leaving behind the stone symbols of a world that could no longer sustain them, and carrying their culture toward the promise of the sea and the north. Their civilization continued, but its center of gravity had shifted forever. This leads us to the final, most human dimension of the story. What was it actually like for a family, for a community, to make that impossible decision to leave everything behind? Their world was not a collection of isolated cities, but a single, intricate machine. Picture a vast and complex clockwork, where each gear, from the smallest farmer's field to the grandest royal court, was interlocked with the others. For centuries, this machine ran with astonishing precision, driving the rise of a brilliant civilization. But systems theory tells us that the more interconnected and optimized a machine becomes, the more vulnerable it is to a cascade failure. A single, stressed component can seize, placing unbearable strain on the next, until the entire mechanism grinds to a halt. This is the lens through which we can finally see the Maya collapse not as a mystery, but as a tragic inevitability. Their society was a network, and when multiple shocks hit at once, they created a feedback loop of disaster that no one could stop. Consider a single drought in a critical agricultural region. It begins as an environmental event, a lack of rain. That stress immediately transfers to the social component, the farmers who depend on that rain. Crops fail, leading to local food shortages. This creates a human wave as families are forced to leave their homes in search of sustenance, becoming refugees. They flow into the territory of a neighboring city-state, a place that may already be managing its own strained resources. Suddenly, the social and political gears are jammed. The incoming refugees create competition for food, water, and land. Tensions escalate, and what might have been a manageable local shortage sparks open conflict between politics. This warfare then damages the economic components of the network. trade routes, the vital channels that moved obsidian for tools, jade for ritual, and salt for preservation, are severed by the fighting. A merchant cannot travel a road controlled by an enemy city. Now the failure ripples further. Without access to traded goods, the internal functioning of each city-state is impaired. Obsidian was not just for ceremony, it was the primary material for sharp, durable cutting tools used in farming, construction, and craft. A shortage of obsidian means less efficient farming and a reduced ability to maintain infrastructure, even as the need for both becomes more desperate. At the same time, the king's legitimacy, the ideological gear at the very center of the machine, is failing on multiple fronts. He has failed as a rainmaker in the face of drought. He is now failing as a protector in the face of warfare, and he is failing as a provider, as the economic network that supplied prestige goods and essential materials collapses. His divine authority, the lubricant that kept the social gears moving smoothly, evaporates. Complexity scientists who study ancient societies point out that the Maya had built a system that was incredibly efficient during stable times, but it had little redundancy, little built-in slack to absorb major shocks. Every part was optimized for peak performance under ideal conditions. When the environment, that most fundamental of all conditions, began to shift, the stresses multiplied through every connected part of the system. The drought amplified political rivalries. Those rivalries shattered economic connections. The economic collapse then undermined the religious and political authority needed to organize a large-scale response. Each problem made the others worse in a vicious, accelerating cycle. What looked from the outside like a sudden collapse was, in reality, a synergistic crisis. It was not merely a drought plus some warfare plus a trade decline. It was the dangerous interaction of all these factors, where the total effect was far greater than the sum of its parts. The machine did not slowly wind down, it seized. The interconnectedness that had been the source of their strength, the very thing that allowed for such cultural flourishing, became the vector for their unraveling. Once the cascade began, it moved with a speed that must have been terrifying to witness, leaving people with only one rational choice: to step away from the broken machine and seek a simpler, more resilient way to live. This understanding reframes their departure not as a failure of will, but as a logical response to systemic breakdown. It also prompts a final, haunting reflection for our own world, one built on networks infinitely more complex than the Maya could have ever conceived. This leaves us with a powerful but misleading image, that of a civilization swallowed whole by the jungle. For generations, the story told was one of a mysterious vanishing, a people who simply evaporated into thin air, leaving behind only silent ruins for us to ponder. This romantic notion, however, is a myth that modern scholarship has completely dismantled. It is time to set the record straight and separate enduring fiction from archaeological fact. First, let's address the discarded theories, the dramatic single causes that capture the imagination but fail under scrutiny. Was it a catastrophic earthquake that leveled every city from Tikal to Capon at once? The geology simply doesn't support it. While seismic activity occurs in the region, the pattern of damage and abandonment is inconsistent and spread over centuries, not a single apocalyptic event. What about a devastating epidemic, a plague that swept through the population? Again, the timeline is wrong. The great pandemics brought by Europeans, like smallpox, arrived centuries after the classic centers were already abandoned. There is no evidence in the skeletal record for a single, continent-wide disease event in the 9th century. Perhaps it was a massive peasant revolt, a revolution of the common people against a decadent elite. While social stress was certainly a factor, the archaeology does not show a pattern of coordinated, violent overthrow. Palaces were not burned in conquest, they were quietly left behind. These simplistic stories of a single, catastrophic end are compelling, but they are not history. They are a disservice to the complexity of the past. The most important correction is this: the Maya people did not disappear. Their descendants are not a lost race. Today, millions of people across Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, El Salvador, and southern Mexico speak Mayan languages, maintain rich cultural traditions, and carry forward a heritage that stretches back for millennia. The collapse was not a biological or demographic extinction. It was a political and geographical transformation. What truly ended was a specific system, the model of the powerful, centralized city-state ruled by a divine king in the southern lowlands. That particular way of organizing society, of concentrating power and labor to build monumental capitals, became unsustainable. When we reframe the question from why did the Maya vanish to why did this specific political system fail, we move from a supernatural mystery to a deeply human and historical one. The failure of states, the reorganization of societies, the migration of populations away from stressed cores, these are not rare anomalies. They are recurring patterns in the human story, from the Akkadians to the Romans. The Maya case is not a bizarre exception. It is one of the clearest and most studied examples we have of how interconnected systems can unravel. This shift in perspective is crucial. It replaces the myth of a vanished people with the far more profound reality of a resilient culture that made an agonizing collective choice to walk away from one way of life in order to preserve another. They traded pyramids for port towns, divine kings for merchant councils, and in doing so, they ensured their world would continue, just in a form the old kings would never have recognized. While the southern forests grew silent, a new skyline rose from the flat limestone plains of the north. The pyramid known as El Castillo at Chichen Itza stands not as a ruin of collapse, but as a bold declaration of a civilization's stubborn persistence. To truly understand why the old order fell, we must also examine the places where it did not, where Maya culture not only survived but reinvented itself with remarkable vitality. This story unfolds in the northern lowlands of the Yucatan Peninsula, a region that followed a profoundly different trajectory during the very centuries the southern cities were being abandoned. Here, cities like Chichen Itza, Uxmal, and Koba did not just endure. They entered a period of extraordinary flourishing known as the Terminal Classic and Post-Classic periods. Their success reveals the collapse for what it was, not a universal apocalypse, but a regional crisis that prompted a dramatic geographical and cultural shift. The key to this northern exception lay in a fundamental advantage: water. Unlike the southern heartland, which relied entirely on precarious seasonal rainfall and elaborate reservoir systems, the Yucatan is a vast limestone shelf. Rainwater doesn't pool on the surface, it filters down through the porous rock, creating a hidden network of underground rivers. Access to this life-giving resource came in the form of cenotes, those stunning natural sinkholes where the ceiling of a water-filled cave has collapsed, opening a portal to the aquifer below. For the northern Maya, these were not just water sources, they were sacred wells, portals to the underworld, and the foundation of urban life. A city like Chichen Itza, whose name means at the mouth of the well of the Itza, was literally built around this guaranteed water supply. This hydrological stability provided a crucial buffer against the droughts that crippled the south. While southern kings pleaded for rain, northern rulers could point to the permanent, deep water in the cenote as proof of their enduring connection to the gods. This environmental resilience was matched by an economic reorientation. As overland trade routes through the war-torn south became untenable, the northern cities capitalized on their position. The Yucatan coast became the new economic highway. Large seagoing canoes established maritime trade networks that stretched around the peninsula and across the Gulf of Mexico to the rising powers of central Mexico. Chichen Itza, positioned to control both coastal and inland trade, grew into a cosmopolitan hub. Its art and architecture tell a story of dynamic synthesis, not decline. Here you see the unmistakable imprint of contact with central Mexican cultures, likely the Toltecs, feathered serpent columns, depictions of warriors with distinctive Toltec-style regalia, and the famous Great Ball Court, the largest in Mesoamerica, all speak of a society confidently absorbing new ideas and weaving them into the existing Maya cultural fabric. This was not a foreign invasion replacing Maya culture, but a strategic fusion, a new political and economic model emerging from long-distance exchange. The sprawling, relatively decentralized layout of Chichen Itza, with its large colonnaded halls and extensive marketplaces, suggests a society governed more by merchant councils and confederacies than by the singular, divine kings of the classic South. The northern exception proves a critical rule: the collapse was system-specific. It was the failure of a particular political model, the divine kingship of the southern lowlands, and its intensely localized, rainfall-dependent agricultural base. When that model became untenable, the civilization's center of gravity simply moved. Power, people, and cultural innovation relocated to where the water was more reliable and the economic opportunities were brighter. The Maya civilization did not evaporate, it transformed, demonstrating a resilience that is often overlooked in the dramatic tale of abandoned cities. The people adapted, carrying their knowledge, their language, and their identity with them to new homes, building a future that looked different from the past but was undeniably, powerfully, still Maya. The silent stones of a city cannot tell us everything. To understand the final days of the Maya, we must listen to the other witnesses, the people themselves. In quiet laboratories, bioarchaeologists study the bones and teeth of those who lived through the collapse, and these remains hold a detailed, heartbreaking record of a society coming apart at the seams. This is the science of reading a life from a skeleton, and it reveals the human cost behind the grand theories of drought and war. Teeth, for instance, become tiny time capsules. By analyzing the chemical isotopes locked within the enamel, scientists can reconstruct a person's diet from childhood. Studies from the terminal classic period show a troubling trend. The chemical signatures indicate that diets became less diverse and more heavily reliant on maize, with fewer sources of animal protein. This is the isotopic fingerprint of a narrowing food supply, a sign that people were not just hungry but malnourished, their bodies lacking the full range of nutrients needed for health and growth. This stress left its mark on the bones too. Skeletons from this era often show lines of arrested growth, like rings in a tree formed during a bad season. These lines, called Harris lines, appear when a child's development is temporarily halted by severe illness or famine. Their frequency increases dramatically in the centuries leading up to abandonment, telling us that the youngest and most vulnerable were bearing a heavy burden. The story continues with evidence of illness. Weakened by poor nutrition, the population became far more susceptible to infection. Bones from the period show lesions, small pits and scars left by chronic diseases that the body struggled to fight off. While we cannot diagnose specific illnesses from bones alone, the pattern is clear: systemic health was declining. Bioarchaeologists note that rates of these stress markers and evidence of infection are significantly higher in the terminal classic than in earlier, more stable periods. The data suggests a grim reality: the average lifespan likely shortened, and childhood mortality rates rose. As one researcher summarized, the biological evidence points to a population under immense and sustained physical strain. Then there is the evidence of conflict, written not in grand battle narratives but on individual skeletons. In several sites, remains from the final occupation phases show traumatic injuries. We find skull fractures from blunt force, parry fractures on forearms from raising them in defense, and cut marks on bones. This is not the organized warfare of kings, but the more intimate, desperate violence of a society fraying. It speaks of raids, local conflicts over dwindling resources, and a breakdown in social order where safety could no longer be taken for granted. Taken together, this bioarchaeological record is devastatingly clear. The models of environmental and political collapse are not just abstract ideas, they manifest in the very bodies of the Maya people. They endured generations of increasing hunger, sickness, and fear. The palaces may have been the first to empty, but the people were the last to break. Their bones tell the ultimate truth that by the end, life in the great cities had become a relentless struggle for survival. This profound biological crisis forces us to ask the most human question of all: when staying means suffering, what would make you finally gather your family and walk away into the unknown? When the rains failed to return, the priests did not abandon their posts. They climbed the temple steps with greater urgency, their ceremonies growing more elaborate, more desperate, as the world dried up around them. This is the spiritual dimension of the collapse, a story not of faith abandoned, but of faith pushed to its breaking point. Archaeology reveals a haunting shift in ritual practice during the terminal classic period. In the sacred cenote at Chichen Itza, divers have recovered a stunning array of offerings from this era: jade, gold, and finely carved objects, but also items that speak of profound supplication. More telling is the evidence from sites across the southern lowlands. Researchers note a marked increase in certain types of dedicatory caches, offerings placed in the foundations of buildings or in ceremonial pits. These often contain symbols of water and fertility, like shells and jade beads carved into water lily motifs. There is also, at some locations, evidence of a final, intense phase of ceremonial construction, sometimes using rougher materials or built directly atop older plazas, as if a new ritual was urgently needed to reset a broken world. The most challenging evidence to interpret points toward an escalation in ceremonial practices intended to directly influence the cosmos. At a few sites, human remains have been found in contexts that some scholars associate with rainmaking rituals, placed in caves or near water sources, which were seen as portals to the underworld, the realm of the rain gods. It is crucial to frame this within its cultural context. For the Maya, this was not an act of cruelty, but the ultimate offering, a desperate attempt to restore balance to a universe that had clearly fallen out of alignment. The life force was being offered to nourish the gods, so that the gods might, in turn, nourish the earth. This suggests a terrifying spiral. As the environmental crisis deepened, the ruling elite, the priests and kings whose power was entirely vested in their role as divine intermediaries, likely doubled down on the very ideological system that was failing them. Their response to a loss of control was to attempt to reassert it through intensified ritual. They performed more ceremonies, commissioned more temples, and may have believed that only a greater sacrifice could break the drought. To a populace suffering from hunger and disease, however, this escalation could have had two effects. For some, it may have represented a final, hopeful gamble, a sign their leaders were pulling out all the stops to save them. For many others, watching resources poured into ever more extreme ceremonies while their children went hungry, it may have been the final act of alienation. It would have made the failure of the covenant starkly visible. If the gods were still not listening, then the entire premise of the state was a lie. The relationship between disaster and religious fervor is complex. In times of existential dread, people can either lose faith or cling to it with a ferocious intensity. The Maya elite appear to have chosen the latter path, attempting to ritualize their way out of a catastrophe. In the end, this fervor proved futile. The stones of their last, hastily built shrines were soon overgrown, a silent testament to the moment a civilization realized that even its most profound prayers could not command the clouds. This spiritual exhaustion leads us to the final, most intimate scale of the collapse, the moment the decision was made not by kings or priests, but by individual families standing at the edge of their empty fields. We often think of collapse as a single, thunderous event. A wall is breached, a capital is sacked, and an empire falls in a day. History, however, rarely conforms to such clean, dramatic breaks. The real story is often one of erosion, not explosion. Compare two famous ends. The Western Roman Empire did not vanish with the sack of Rome in 410. Its political structures had been weakening for generations, its borders slowly dissolving, until the last emperor was simply deposed in 476, a final administrative formality after a long fade. Contrast that with the Byzantine Empire, which endured for another 1,000 years through a slow, grinding decline of lost territories, economic strain, and military pressure, until Constantinople finally fell in 1453. Both were collapses, but their rhythms were utterly different. So where does the Maya story fit on this spectrum between a sudden break and a slow fade? The evidence points to a complex, rolling crisis, a wave of failure that washed across the southern lowlands not in a single tide, but in a series of relentless surges. Take the beautiful city of Capon, nestled in a valley in modern-day Honduras. Here, the end did not come swiftly. Archaeological layers tell a story of a century-long decline. The first signs appear in the elite core, the sculptor's workshops where master craftsmen once carved the intricate portraits of kings, fell silent. The grand palace compounds, the administrative heart of the city, were gradually abandoned. The ruling dynasty seemed to lose its grip, its ability to command the labor and loyalty needed to maintain its own prestige. Yet life continued in the outlying farmsteads for a generation or two more. People still lived in the valley, but they no longer served the central authority. The city's political and ceremonial functions simply withered away over multiple human lifetimes. This is the very definition of a slow fade, a top-down unraveling where the social contract dissolved long before the last person left. But not every city experienced such a gradual letting go. For some, the end may have been sharper, triggered by a final, shattering blow. Consider a city-state already weakened by decades of drought, its people malnourished and its resources depleted. Then a rival kingdom sees its moment. A decisive military campaign breaches its defenses. The sacred precinct is overrun, the king captured or lost. In the chaos that follows, the remaining population, with their last pillar of protection gone, might flee en masse. This scenario could explain the more abrupt abandonment at some fortified sites, where defensive walls were built in haste and the final occupation layer suggests a sudden departure. A single, crippling drought event, worse than all the others, could have a similar effect, snapping the last thread of hope for a community already hanging by a frayed rope. Zoom out to the entire region and the timeline becomes clear. The collapse was not an event with a single date. It was a process, a rolling crisis that spanned roughly 150 years, from about 750 to 900 of the Common Era. It moved like a wave of darkness from city-state to city-state. Palenque fell into silence around the end of the 8th century. Tikal's last monument dates to 869. Some smaller centers held on a few decades longer. Each polity, connected yet independent, succumbed to a similar combination of pressures, but at its own pace and with its own final trigger. Drought, warfare, and failing faith were the common themes, but the symphony of collapse had different movements in every valley. This staggered timeline is actually one of the strongest arguments against a single, external cause like an invasion or a continent-wide plague. Those would have struck everywhere nearly simultaneously. What the Maya experienced was a systemic failure, a domino effect where the fall of one trading partner, one ally, increased the strain on the next, accelerating the wave. It was the sound of a network breaking apart, one connection at a time, until only silence remained. The Grand Plaza is finally silent, but the story is not over. For the families who made the agonizing choice to leave, the journey did not end at the city's edge. They walked away from the stone monuments and empty reservoirs, carrying their children, their tools, and the seeds saved from the last harvest, moving back into the embrace of the forest they had once cleared. This was not a disappearance, but a deliberate dispersal, a process scholars call ruralization. The population did not vanish from the earth. It simply redistributed itself across the landscape, flowing from unsustainable urban centers back into smaller, more manageable village communities. Imagine a vast, intricate tapestry slowly unpicking itself. The grand, centralized patterns woven by kings, the pyramids, the palaces, the wide causeways gradually frayed and fell apart. But the fundamental threads, the countless individual strands of daily knowledge and custom, remained strong. Those threads were then rewoven into a new, more resilient fabric, one of scattered homesteads and small hamlets. In these new settlements, life continued, profoundly changed in scale but deeply familiar in its rhythms. The Maya language was still spoken around the hearth. The milpa cycle of clearing, planting, and fallowing continued, now on a scale the land could support without the intense pressure of feeding a mega-city. Families still honored their ancestors and the cycles of the moon with household rituals, perhaps at a simple family shrine instead of a towering temple. The knowledge of how to cultivate maize, how to weave cotton, how to track the seasons by the stars, this was the adaptive, practical wisdom that endured long after the last king's name was forgotten. This post-collapse life was in many ways a rational adaptation to a new reality. The grandiose political and economic machine of the classic period had broken down, but the people themselves and the core of their cultural identity persisted. They traded the burdens of taxation and monumental labor for a focus on household and kinship. They exchanged the vulnerability of a single, massive reservoir for the security of many small, scattered water sources. The collapse of the state did not erase the civilization. It forced a return to its most fundamental and resilient unit, the community and the family. In letting go of the world of the holy lords, they secured the survival of the world of the people. The heart of Maya civilization continued to beat, not in the stone plazas, but in the forest clearings and along the quiet coasts, a testament to the enduring power of culture when it is carried not in monuments, but in memory and daily practice. The Maya story is not just a chapter in a history book, it is a mirror. Look at the map of their lowlands, a region of delicate environmental balance, and then look at our own world. The parallels are not exact, but the underlying patterns are hauntingly familiar. Today, we see entire regions grappling with water scarcity, from the American Southwest to parts of Africa and Asia. We see agricultural systems strained by changing climate patterns, and dense urban populations utterly dependent on intricate, long-distance supply chains for food and energy. The Maya world was a microcosm of these challenges, a scaled-down model of a complex society pushing against its ecological limits. Their collapse offers us more than just archaeological intrigue. It provides a profound case study in the principles of long-term sustainability and societal resilience. What can we learn from their experience? Several key lessons emerge, each one a stark warning written in stone and soil. First, the danger of over-reliance on a single environmental resource. The Maya built a magnificent civilization on a foundation of predictable seasonal rain. When that single pillar of their existence began to wobble, the entire structure came down. For us, the lesson is clear. Our modern global civilization is built on a foundation of fossil fuels, a finite resource with immense environmental consequences. Our food systems often rely on monoculture crops and globalized trade, creating vulnerabilities to disease, drought, or political disruption. The Maya remind us that putting all our eggs in one ecological basket is a strategy with a terrifyingly short shelf life. Second, the fragility of hyper-complex, interconnected systems. The Maya network of trade, politics, and religion was a masterpiece of efficiency, but it had no backup plan. When drought struck, it didn't just cause a food shortage, it triggered a cascade failure that shattered trade, dissolved political alliances, and destroyed religious faith. In our hyper-connected world, we see this principle in action constantly. A pandemic disrupts global supply chains. A cyber attack can paralyze a nation's energy grid. A financial crisis in one country echoes around the planet. Our systems are exponentially more complex than the Mayas, which means their potential for cascading failure is exponentially greater. The lesson is not to abandon complexity, but to build in redundancy, flexibility, and local resilience, so that a shock in one area doesn't bring the whole network to its knees. Third, the profound risk of tying political legitimacy to forces beyond human control. The Maya king's power was divine, rooted in his perceived ability to bring rain. When the rains failed, so did his authority. In our modern context, we might see echoes of this when governments stake their credibility on promises of endless economic growth or absolute environmental stability, outcomes that are vulnerable to global market forces or climatic shifts they cannot fully command. When a population feels its leaders have failed to deliver on fundamental promises of security and prosperity, the social contract frays, just as it did in the Maya plazas. Finally, the peril of elite isolation. The Maya ruling class, secure in their stone palaces, may have been the last to feel the full brunt of the drought's impact, continuing their rituals while the common people suffered. This disconnect between the rulers and the ruled eroded trust and made collective, adaptive action impossible. Today, we see similar dynamics where economic or political elites can become insulated from the immediate hardships caused by environmental degradation or economic policy, creating a dangerous gap in understanding and empathy. The Maya collapse teaches us that a civilization's survival depends not just on its technical ingenuity, but on its social cohesion and the shared experience of its people. Their story is a cautionary tale, a reminder that no civilization, no matter how brilliant or powerful, is immune to the consequences of ecological mismanagement and deep social inequality. They were not primitive or foolish, they were highly advanced people who built a world that could not sustain itself forever. In that, their silent cities ask us a direct and urgent question: are we, in our own age of soaring complexity and environmental stress, building a world that can? The final monuments tell a story their kings never intended to share. As the great cities neared their end, the scribes who carved history into stone began to record a different kind of truth. Their glyphs, once filled with the confident language of divine victory and cosmic order, start to whisper of a world slipping from its axis. Epigraphers, the scholars who decode this ancient script, have noticed a subtle but profound shift in the rhetoric of these late inscriptions. Where earlier texts celebrated the king capturing the Star War of arrival, later ones might speak of a city being wrapped in darkness or of a dynasty experiencing loss. One poignant example comes from a monument at the site of Piedras Negras. The text describes a period not of triumph, but of instability, using a phrase that scholars translate as "the earth was troubled." This isn't the language of power, it's the language of profound disorientation. These are not casual descriptions. In a worldview where the king's very purpose was to maintain balance between the human and divine realms, for the earth itself to be troubled was a catastrophic admission. It suggests the scribes, the most educated elite and the official custodians of reality, were struggling to fit the chaos around them into the traditional narrative. The ideology of the Maya state was built on a core belief in cyclical time, where history repeated in grand patterns and the king's rituals ensured the sun would rise and the rains would return. But what happens when the cycles break, when the drought stretches for a generation and the rituals clearly fail? The scribes faced an impossible task. They could either continue writing the old, triumphant script, which would have felt like a hollow lie, or they could attempt to document the unraveling, which would undermine the very foundation of the state they served. The increasing rarity and eventual cessation of monument carving may be the most telling clue of all. It wasn't merely that they ran out of stone or stonemasons. It was that the story they were hired to tell, the story of divine kings ensuring a prosperous, orderly world, had become impossible to believe, let alone carve for eternity. The written word, that mighty pillar of Maya intellectual achievement, did not just fade away. It was quietly set down because the world it was designed to describe had ceased to exist. The silence of the stelae, then, is not an empty silence. It is the sound of an ideology hitting its limit, the moment a civilization's own records confess, in their final, troubled glyphs, that the old answers no longer hold. Their silent cities are not alone in the pages of history. From the dust of Mesopotamia to the jungles of Cambodia, the story of a great civilization reaching a peak only to later dissolve is one that repeats across continents and millennia. The Akkadian Empire, often called the world's first true empire, crumbled under severe aridification around 4,200 years ago. The sophisticated, grid-planned cities of the Indus Valley, like Mohenjo-Daro, were depopulated by shifting river courses and climatic shifts. The Western Roman Empire fragmented under a combination of internal strife, economic strain, and the movement of peoples. Centuries later, the magnificent Khmer capital of Ankara, with its vast hydraulic network, was gradually abandoned as its water management system failed amid climatic instability and political change. Each of these stories is a unique tapestry, yet when we lay them side by side with the Maya collapse, certain hauntingly familiar threads emerge. We see the recurring stress of a changing climate. For the Akkadians and the Maya, it was prolonged drought. For the Indus cities, it was the disappearance of reliable river systems. For Ankara, it was an intense monsoon cycle that its canals could no longer control. Environmental shock appears again and again as a primary trigger, a force that exposes every hidden weakness in a society's foundations. Another common thread is internal conflict and political fragmentation. As resources grow scarce, cooperation often gives way to competition. The late Roman Empire was riddled with civil wars and usurpers, splitting its focus and draining its treasury, much like the Star Wars that consumed Maya city-states in their final centuries. Economic disruption is a third universal symptom. Trade networks that once carried prosperity become conduits for collapse when they break down, isolating communities and creating scarcity, whether it was the Roman grain supply from Egypt or the Maya exchange of obsidian and jade. Yet for all these parallels, the Maya case stands apart in several profound ways. Their civilization rose and fell not in a river valley or an arid plain, but in a dense, biodiverse tropical rainforest, an environment once thought incapable of supporting vast urban populations. Their achievement in doing so makes their subsequent vulnerability to even minor climatic shifts all the more startling. Unlike the Western Romans, who faced significant external migratory pressures, or the Akkadians, who contended with nomadic incursions, the Maya collapse lacks a clear foreign invading force. The enemy was largely internal, a product of their own interconnected systems turning against them. Most distinctively, the ideological component was absolute. The Maya king was not just a political or military leader, he was a divine axis mundi, the literal link between humanity and the gods. When the rains failed, it wasn't just an agricultural crisis, it was a direct refutation of the cosmic order. This fusion of political power with spiritual responsibility created a fragility unlike that of a purely administrative empire like Rome. A Roman emperor could be replaced without ending the world, but a Maya holy lord's failure meant the universe itself was out of balance. By placing the Maya within this global gallery of fallen civilizations, we stop seeing them as a singular, mystical disappearance. Instead, we recognize them as a powerful case study in a recurring historical pattern. Complex urban societies with their dense populations, specialized labor, and intricate infrastructure create tremendous resilience and cultural wealth. But that very complexity can also breed vulnerabilities, tight couplings between systems that allow a crisis in one area to cascade uncontrollably through all the others. The Maya example, with its exquisite detail preserved in stone and sediment, teaches us that collapse is rarely about one cause. It is about the dangerous interaction of environmental limits, political rigidity, economic interdependence, and sometimes a foundational belief system that cannot adapt to a changed world. Their story becomes less a mystery and more a mirror, reflecting back a fundamental question about the societies we build today. Their astronomical tables could predict the transit of Venus with breathtaking accuracy, yet they could not foresee the dust gathering in their own reservoirs. This is the profound paradox of Maya innovation. They were master problem solvers, architects of a civilization built on intellectual and technological triumphs that still inspire awe. Their mathematical system included the concept of zero, a conceptual leap many other great civilizations never achieved independently. Their calendars tracked time with a precision that rivals our own. Their water management, from the vast reservoir at Tikal to the intricate canal systems at Karakol, represented a deep understanding of their environment. So we must ask a difficult, counterfactual question. With such formidable knowledge, why could they not engineer their way out of crisis? The answer lies not in a lack of ingenuity, but in the inherent limits of technology when the systems that support it begin to fail. Consider their water infrastructure. It was brilliantly designed for the climate they knew, capturing and storing seasonal rainfall to last through the annual dry period. But these systems were engineered for a specific range of conditions. A reservoir is a buffer, not an infinite source. When a drought extends for decades, not months, the buffer empties and does not refill. The technology itself hits a physical limit. Furthermore, these were monumental public works requiring immense organized labor and expert maintenance. As political authority fragmented and populations became malnourished and displaced, who would dredge the canals or repair the plaster linings of the tanks? The knowledge of how to do it may have still existed in the minds of aging engineers, but the social organization, the collective will, and the surplus resources needed to mobilize that knowledge had evaporated. Their technology was not scalable to meet a crisis of that magnitude, and it was not maintainable in a society coming apart. The same principle applies to their agricultural adaptations. The raised fields and terraces were marvels of productivity, but they also required constant, coordinated upkeep. They were part of a managed landscape, a kind of green machine. When the social machine that operated it broke down when farmers were conscripted for war or fled for their safety, the physical machine began to break down too. Weeds choked the canals, terraces crumbled, and the carefully curated soil began to wash away. Their astronomical prowess offered no solution here. They could chart the cycles of the rain god Chak in the stars, but that celestial knowledge could not halt the literal erosion of the land beneath their feet. This reveals a crucial insight. Technological solutions are not standalone miracles. They are born from and embedded within specific social, political, and economic frameworks. A reservoir is not just an engineering feat, it is a political statement built by a king commanding labor, maintained by a social hierarchy, and relied upon by a populace that believes in the system. The Maya innovations were products of a stable, confident, and centralized classic period society. When that foundational society was stressed to the breaking point by environmental and political shocks, the very platforms that sustained their technologies began to wobble and then collapse. The brilliant tools remained, but the workshop was on fire. Innovation, no matter how advanced, cannot always insulate a civilization from systemic failure. It can even create new vulnerabilities, fostering a reliance on complex systems that become liabilities when conditions change. The Maya did not fail for a lack of intelligence or invention. They encountered a set of intertwined problems so vast and so fundamental that their technological toolkit, designed for a different world, could not provide the answers. Their story warns us that knowledge alone is not enough. It is the resilience of the society that holds that knowledge, its flexibility, its cohesion, its ability to adapt, that ultimately determines whether innovation becomes a lifeline or merely a fascinating relic for future generations to unearth. A final painted bowl left unfinished in a potter's workshop tells its own story of an ending. The scene depicts a procession, but the figures lack the crisp, elegant lines of earlier masterpieces. The postures seem stiff, the pigments less vibrant, applied with a hastier hand. This subtle shift in craftsmanship is our seventh clue, a silent witness to a world losing its former certainty. In the art of the terminal classic period, the confident visual language of the Maya elite begins to fracture, revealing through imagery what the texts no longer recorded. The most telling change is in the subject matter itself, where high classic art glorified the serene, divine king in moments of ritual accession or communion with ancestors. Late period works increasingly turn to themes of conflict and martial power. We see more frequent depictions of bound captives, of warriors in aggressive stances, and of symbols associated with warfare. The Holy Lord is still present, but now he is often shown as a conqueror, his divinity proven through subjugation rather than peaceful ceremony. This iconographic shift from spiritual sovereign to war leader reflects the changing reality of the times. As the drought tightened its grip and resources grew scarce, the king's most immediate tool for survival and legitimacy became the army, not the priesthood. The art mirrors this desperate pivot, emphasizing control through force in a world where control through cosmic harmony had evidently failed. Beyond subject matter, the very quality of artistic production often declines. Monumental sculpture becomes less common, and when it appears, the carving can be shallower, the details less refined. Polychrome pottery, once a canvas for intricate mythological scenes, sometimes features more repetitive, simplified designs. This isn't a loss of skill, but likely a symptom of dwindling resources and social disruption. Grand artistic programs require patronage, stable workshops, and teams of highly trained artisans supported by a functioning economy. As elite coffers emptied and the social order fragmented, the long apprenticeships and leisurely creation times needed for masterpieces may have vanished. Art became more utilitarian, perhaps produced faster for a nobility that needed symbols of power now, not timeless heirlooms for a secure future. These visual changes form a non-textual chronicle of anxiety. The hurried brushstroke, the martial focus, the fading grandeur, all speak of a ruling class under immense pressure. Their art, which had always served to legitimize and glorify their world, could no longer maintain the same illusion of eternal, divinely ordained order. It began to reflect the turmoil outside the palace walls, capturing a society where the aesthetic ideals of the past were slowly being eroded by the urgent demands of a crumbling present. The ruins of Palenque did not whisper their secrets to the first European eyes that saw them. When explorer John Lloyd Stephens and artist Frederick Catherwood ventured into the Central American jungle in the 1830s, they beheld a spectacle of profound strangeness. Catherwood's exquisite, haunting illustrations depicted vine-choked pyramids and ornate facades peering from a relentless green sea. In their best-selling books, Stephens described these places with awe as the remnants of a vanished race, a mysterious civilization that had disappeared without a trace. This romantic framing was not a neutral observation. It was the first layer of a narrative that would shape the Maya collapse for over a century. The story we tell about the end of the Maya world has never been just about the Maya. It is also a mirror reflecting the fears, fascinations, and blind spots of the people telling it. For those 19th century explorers, steeped in the romantic ideal of the noble savage and lost civilizations, the empty cities confirmed a worldview where indigenous peoples could not possibly be the descendants of such grandeur. The mystery was born from this assumption of disappearance, a convenient narrative that ignored the living Maya communities tending their milpas in the shadows of those very ruins. As archaeology developed, theories about the collapse evolved with the intellectual currents of the times. In the early 20th century, influenced by ideas of migration and conflict, scholars often pointed to a single, dramatic cause. Perhaps it was a massive invasion from central Mexico or a violent peasant revolt against a cruel theocracy. These were simple, satisfying stories that fit an era seeking clear historical narratives of rise and fall. Later, during the Cold War, with its anxieties about social upheaval and resource competition, some interpretations leaned into models of internal warfare and economic collapse. Each generation of thinkers, consciously or not, projected its own contemporary anxieties onto the silent stones. The late 20th century brought a pivotal shift, driven by new scientific tools. As concerns about environmental degradation and climate change entered the global conversation, researchers began to find hard evidence in lake cores and cave formations. The multi-causal model that dominates today, a complex interplay of drought, agricultural strain, political fragmentation, and ideological crisis, reflects our modern understanding of deeply interconnected systems. It is a theory for an age acutely aware of ecological fragility and systemic risk. This evolution of thought reveals a crucial truth. The quest to solve the Maya collapse has always been a dialogue between the past and the present. The Romantics saw a poetic mystery, the early archaeologists saw a historical puzzle with a single solution, and the modern interdisciplinary scientist sees a cautionary case study in sustainability. Our explanations are filtered through the lens of our own time's greatest concerns. Recognizing this bias is not a weakness, it is the foundation of true scientific objectivity. It allows us to separate the evidence in the ground from the stories we wish to tell about it. It reminds us that the living Maya were never truly lost, only their particular political system was, and that their descendants hold continuous threads of knowledge that stretch back to the classic period itself. To understand why the cities were abandoned, we must first understand why we were so determined to see them as a mystery in the first place. The ground beneath the Maya world is still giving up its secrets. While the broad strokes of the collapse are now clear, active archaeological digs across Central America continue to uncover layers of detail that challenge our assumptions and deepen the mystery. This is not a closed case, but a dynamic investigation where every new trench and every freshly scanned laser image from the jungle canopy can rewrite a paragraph of the story. The consensus on drought and systemic failure is strong, yet within that framework, stubborn and fascinating puzzles remain, driving researchers back into the field season after season. One of the most persistent questions is also one of the most basic. Why did some cities fall decades, even a century, before others? If a regional megadrought was the primary trigger, we might expect a more synchronized collapse. Yet the timeline is staggered. A city like Chichen entered its long decline in the 8th century, while others, like Sable, even experienced a brief final renaissance before fading away. This suggests that local factors, the skill of a particular ruler, the specific design of a water catchment system, or the strength of alliances played a decisive role in a city's fate. It forces us to see the collapse not as a single event that swept uniformly across the land, but as 1,000 local tragedies, each with its own unique script. Unraveling the precise sequence of events in individual centers is a major focus. Archaeologists are meticulously dating the last construction phases, the final pottery styles left in homes, and the order in which different city districts were abandoned. Was the temple the last place left occupied, or was it the first to be deserted? The answer varies, and each variation tells a different story about how the end actually unfolded for the people who lived it. Perhaps the most profound gap in our understanding lies with the commoners, the vast majority of the population whose lives are less visible in the stone record than those of kings. How did their daily reality change in those final decades? Were they the first to sense the coming crisis, adapting quietly in ways the elite ignored? Bioarchaeology offers clues through diet and health, but the social and emotional landscape is harder to map. Did families begin to quietly stockpile goods, or did they increasingly look to local village leaders instead of the distant king? Finding the humble farmsteads from this era and analyzing the objects of everyday life within them is crucial work, as it shifts the narrative from the palace to the porch, revealing how the collapse was lived and felt by ordinary people. This leads to another open question. Is there evidence for last-ditch attempts at reform or adaptation that we simply haven't recognized? We tend to see the escalation of warfare and ritual as a doubling down on a failing system. But could some of these actions have been desperate, innovative attempts to save it? Perhaps the construction of a new, smaller temple represented not feudal grandeur, but a pragmatic shift to a different, more localized form of worship. Maybe certain trade alliances in the final days were bold economic reorganizations. Archaeologists now look at the terminal layers of cities with this lens, searching not just for evidence of breakdown, but for signs of ingenious, if ultimately unsuccessful, human resilience in the face of disaster. These unanswered questions are what make Maya archaeology so alive. Every season, a newly discovered inscription might hint at a forgotten king's response to drought, or a sediment core might reveal a hyper-local climate anomaly that spared or doomed a particular valley. Each piece of data has the potential to refine our models, to add nuance to the story of a civilization navigating the limits of its world. The mystery of the Maya collapse, therefore, is not a problem to be solved and filed away. It is an ongoing conversation between the past and the present, a reminder that history is never truly finished as long as we keep listening to the quiet voices emerging from the earth. The final chapter of the Maya story is not written in empty plazas, but in the bustling highland markets of Guatemala and the quiet fishing villages along the Caribbean coast. For millions of people, the Maya world did not end, it transformed, carrying forward a vibrant cultural heartbeat that has endured for over 1,000 years since the last stone monument was carved. To focus solely on the collapse of the classic period cities is to miss the far more profound narrative of resilience, adaptation, and an unbroken thread of identity. After the traumatic reorganization of the 9th and 10th centuries, Maya civilization entered a new phase, the post-classic period. In the northern Yucatan, powerful states like Mayapon arose, governed by councils of elite families rather than a single divine king, a pragmatic shift in political structure. These were sophisticated, trade-oriented societies connected to vast networks across the Gulf of Mexico. Then came the seismic shock of the Spanish arrival in the 16th century, a confrontation that brought disease, forced labor, and a relentless campaign to erase indigenous belief. Yet even here, the story is one of fierce resistance and cultural preservation. The last independent Maya kingdom, Nojpatane, fell not in the classic collapse, but in the year 1697, after nearly 2 centuries of holding off European incursions. In the highlands, communities secretly maintained their calendars and rituals, weaving ancient gods into the fabric of imposed Catholic saints. This was not surrender, it was a strategic, profound act of memory. Today, that persistence is alive in over 30 distinct Mayan languages spoken by millions, in the intricate patterns of traditional textiles that tell community stories, and in the enduring practice of the Milpa cycle, a sustainable dialogue with the land that has outlasted empires. The abandonment of the mega-cities was a single, albeit devastating, episode in a much longer saga. The true legacy of the Maya is not one of mysterious vanishing, but of breathtaking continuity. They demonstrate that a civilization is not defined solely by its stone monuments, but by the knowledge carried in its language, the bonds of its communities, and its stubborn will to persist. Their history is not a linear arc of rise and fall, but a complex tapestry of challenge, adaptation, and an unwavering connection to a cultural core that has weathered every storm. Standing in the great plaza of Tikal, the silence is not empty but profound. The towering pyramids and broad stone platforms are not just ruins, they are the physical stage where this entire story played out. To visit a place like this is to walk into the final chapter, and with a few guiding thoughts, you can read the collapse in the stones themselves. Look closely at the architecture from the last century of occupation. You might notice a curious detail, a section of wall built with rougher, smaller stones, or a plaster floor patched with a different technique. These are the last-ditch efforts, the hurried repairs of a society that could no longer muster the labor for perfect, monumental construction. It speaks of a kingdom trying to hold itself together with whatever it had left, a tangible sign of dwindling resources and fading control. Climb the steep steps of Temple 1 and look out from the summit. The view today is a breathtaking canopy of green, but in the 9th century it would have been a sprawling urban landscape, a sea of thatched roofs and white plastered walls stretching to the horizon. Now imagine that view changing over a lifetime. From this very perch, a ruler might have watched the smoke from cooking fires grow thinner over the decades, seen outlying neighborhoods fall dark and quiet, observed the once bustling causeways slowly reclaimed by weeds. The psychological weight of that vantage point is staggering, to see your world, your divine responsibility, visibly shrinking before your eyes. What thoughts passed through the mind of the last Holy Lord as he performed his rituals here, pleading to gods who seemed to have turned away, while his city quietly emptied below? On the ground, seek out the final monuments. At many sites, the last stelae erected are often smaller, less intricately carved or placed in odd locations. These were not statements of confidence, but perhaps obligatory acts, a fading tradition carried out from habit rather than conviction. Nearby, you might find evidence of sudden, pragmatic change. At some centers, archaeologists have uncovered hastily built defensive walls cutting across formal plazas, turning sacred space into a fortress. This is the architecture of fear, a clear signal that the greatest threat was no longer spiritual imbalance, but very human conflict pressing at the gates. The true power of these places, however, lies not just in seeing what was built, but in contemplating what was left behind. In the quiet residential compounds, you can almost feel the moment of departure. The sense is not of ransacked treasure, but of a life interrupted. This tangible absence makes the theories real. The drought is no longer an abstract climate curve on a graph. It is the reason a family finally walked away from their home and their ancestors. The political collapse is not just a model of systemic failure. It is the reason a potter left her unfinished bowl, never to return. By engaging with the physical space, we bridge the gap of centuries. We move beyond analyzing causes to empathizing with the human experience of profound transition, to feel the weight of the choice to leave everything familiar behind. It transforms history from a subject into a deeply human story, one written in stone, soil, and silence. There was no single, catastrophic moment when the Maya world ended. Instead, a perfect storm of pressures converged, each one amplifying the next until the entire system could no longer stand. The abandonment of the mega-cities was not a mystery with one solution, but a historical process with many moving parts, a cascade of failures that began in the environment and echoed through every layer of society. To see the full picture, we must weave these separate threads into one coherent narrative. It starts with the sky. Decades of punishing drought, confirmed by the silent testimony of stalagmites and lake sediments, placed an unbearable strain on the agricultural foundation of the civilization. Reservoirs designed for seasonal dry spells emptied and did not refill. Crop failures became chronic, leading to widespread food shortages and the health crises that followed. This environmental shock was the spark, but it landed on a society built with highly flammable materials. The king's sacred covenant was to ensure abundance, and as the fields baked and the granaries emptied, his divine authority evaporated. A political and spiritual crisis now merged with the ecological one. With the central authority weakened, the social fabric began to tear. Competition for the last reliable resources turned violent. The intricate web of alliances between city-states, once maintained through royal marriages and trade, fractured into a desperate scramble. Warfare, once ritualized, became total, aimed at the annihilation of rivals. This political fragmentation then severed the economic lifelines. Trade routes that moved essential goods like obsidian for tools and salt for preservation were cut by conflict. The cities, already starving, became isolated, unable to access the materials needed for their own maintenance and craft. At this point, the feedback loop was complete and accelerating. Drought caused famine, which shattered faith in leadership, which sparked warfare, which collapsed the economy, which made the dense urban centers utterly unsustainable. There was no villain, no invading army, no single fatal error. It was the dangerous interaction of every vulnerability. In the end, faced with this synergistic disaster, the people made a rational choice. They voted with their feet. They dispersed from the monumental cores, leaving behind the stone symbols of a broken world, and retreated into the forest or migrated toward the coasts. They traded the complexity and grandeur of the mega-city for the resilience and simplicity of the village, ensuring their culture's survival by letting a specific political model die. This synthesis shows us that the various theories are not competing. They are complementary chapters in the same story. The environmental, political, social, and economic threads are not separate causes. They are the interconnected strands of a single rope that, under immense strain, finally frayed and snapped. The final silence of the Maya plazas is a testament to a civilization that reached for the sky, yet could not escape the earthly limits of its own creation. Their story transcends the romantic myth of a vanished race, revealing itself instead as one of history's most profound case studies in the fragility of interconnected systems. We have walked from the bustling heart of a mega-city to the quiet moment a family left their home for the last time, tracing a mosaic of causes that, when pieced together, forms a complete and cautionary picture. Drought strained the land, political rivalry shattered alliances, economic networks frayed, and a sacred ideology met its breaking point. None of these forces acted alone. They interacted, each one amplifying the next in a devastating feedback loop that no king, no army, and no ritual could stop. This was not a mystery of magic or a single catastrophic event, but a historical process, a slow unraveling where the very complexity that enabled their brilliance became their greatest vulnerability. That complexity mirrors our modern world in unsettling ways. We too have built societies of breathtaking interconnection, where a shock in one system, a financial market, a supply chain, a climate pattern, can ripple through all the others with alarming speed. The Maya challenge us to look at our own foundations. Are we, like them, over-relying on a single pillar, whether it be a finite resource or an inflexible political structure? Have we built systems so efficient they have no slack, no redundancy for when conditions inevitably change. Their collapse reminds us that sustainability is not about perpetual growth, but about resilience, the capacity to adapt when the old ways cease to work. As we look upon their ruins, now gently cradled by the jungle they once mastered, we are confronted with the poignant observation of historian Jared Diamond that civilizations are not murdered, they commit suicide. The Maya did not fall to a foreign conqueror, they were undone by a perfect storm of their own making, a storm born from the interaction between a changing environment and a society unable to adapt its core beliefs in time. Yet, to label this a simple suicide misses the deeper, more human truth. This is also a story of incredible resilience and adaptation. When the city-states failed, the people did not vanish. They made the rational, painful choice to walk away, carrying their language, their knowledge of the land, and their cultural identity into a new future. They traded pyramids for port towns, divine kings for merchant councils, and in doing so, ensured their world would continue. The abandonment of the mega-cities was not an end, but a transformation, a strategic retreat from one way of life to preserve the essence of another. It is a powerful lesson that the true measure of a civilization may not be the height of its monuments, but the depth of its ability to change. Their legacy, therefore, is a dual one, a warning about the fragility of complex systems, and a testament to the enduring strength of human culture when it is carried forward, not in stone, but in community and memory. What does their journey tell you about the challenges we face today? If exploring history's greatest puzzles lights a spark of curiosity, consider subscribing for more journeys into the unknown. We would love to hear which thread of the Maya story resonates most with you, so share your thoughts in the comments below.